June 6, 1944, 07710 hours, Pointe du Hoc, Normandy, France. If you were Hauptmann Wilfried Duell of the 726th Infantry Regiment, positioned atop a headland of sheer chalk cliff rising 93 feet above the English Channel, you had already run the mathematics and found them comfortable. You understood the tidal window, how it would compress the beach below to a strip of wet shingle no wider than 40 feet at the moment of first light. You understood the geometry of plunging fire, how machine guns sighted at cliff edge could traverse 200 degrees of killing ground with almost no reloading pause. You understood, above all, the physics of the problem facing any force that wanted to reach you. 93 feet of vertical chalk, no handholds, no cover, soaked with channel spray. And at the top, the men of the 716th and 726th Infantry Regiments, armed with Maschinengewehr 42s capable of firing 1,200 rounds per minute, waiting with something very close to professional certainty. The Atlantic Wall doctrine. Atlantic Wall was not a bluff. It was a deduction. Cliffs of that profile, that height, under observed fire from prepared positions, did not get climbed. They had never been climbed. No army in the history of European warfare had assaulted a defended sea cliff of that geometry and survived it in meaningful numbers. Here is the strange detail. Of the 225 Rangers who scaled Pointe du Hoc on June 6, 1944, who climbed under live fire, who reached the top bleeding, who seized and held that position against 2 days of German counterattack, not one of them found what they came to destroy. The 615 Schneiderses that made Pointe du Hoc the single most dangerous artillery position on the entire D-Day coastline, the guns with the range to reach both Utah Beach and Omaha Beach simultaneously, were not there. The gun casements were empty. Here is the sentence that explains the entire Battle of Pointe du Hoc. The Germans built an impenetrable fortress. The Rangers destroyed a target that did not exist, and in doing so, they may have saved 10,000 lives. Neither side knew the other's real mission. That is the paradox. And it begins long before any rope left the ground. Part 1. The Wall That Thought in Straight Lines. To understand why the German defensive system at Pointe du Hoc failed, you have to first understand why the men who built it believed, with complete professional sincerity, that it could not fail. The Atlantic Wall was not improvised. It was the output of a specific doctrinal tradition, the Festungspionierdienst, the German Fortress Engineer Service, operating from a manual of assumptions that had been validated repeatedly and lethally from the Maginot Line to Sebastopol. The core assumption was simple: terrain is a multiplier, and the highest ground with the steepest approach yields the highest multiplication. A defending unit of 100 men in a prepared cliff position with interlocking fields of fire was calculated, in German tactical doctrine, to require a minimum attacking force of 400 men operating with fire superiority and engineer support. That ratio assumed a conventional approach over flat or rolling ground with the defenders visible and the attackers capable of organized suppression. At Pointe du Hoc, the ratio collapsed into something close to infinity. There was no approach over flat ground, there was only the cliff. Organization taut, the construction corps responsible for building the Atlantic Wall fortifications had begun work on Pointe du Hoc in 1942. By June 1944, they had in place 6.5-meter-thick reinforced concrete casemates, observation bunkers with steel cupolas, a fire direction bunker housing the seafront Vorleitungsstelle, the coastal fire control station, and a network of trenches connecting 14 separate fighting positions. The Kriegsmarine had confirmed the range tables for the 611 55mm Schneider howitzers, maximum effective range of 19,500 meters, sufficient to drop shells on transports and landing craft at Utah Beach, 11 kilometers to the west, and Omaha Beach, 6 kilometers to the east. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, in his inspection tour of Atlantic Wall positions in January 1944, singled out Pointe du Hoc as one of the most dangerous artillery positions on the French coast. The guns had to be destroyed before our sort. General Omar Bradley, commanding 1st U.S. Army, assigned the mission to the 2nd Ranger Battalion under Lieutenant Colonel James Earl Reuter, a 34-year-old former college football coach from Brady, Texas, who had trained his 6 companies of Rangers with the specific intent of doing things that field manuals described as inadvisable. Bradley's operational estimate, written in cold planning language, acknowledged the risk. If Rudder's men failed to neutralize the battery by H+30 minutes, the entire Utah Beach landing would be under observed 155mm fire from the point. The German garrison at Pointe du Hoc, roughly 200 men from the 2nd Battalion, 726th Infantry Regiment, reinforced with naval artillery crews, had trained for this geography for nearly 2 years. They knew every meter of the cliff top. They had rehearsed the alarm sequence, Kustanar, coastal alarm, triggered by the naval observation post, followed by the garrison standing to at cliff edge positions within 4 minutes. Lieutenant Ohmsen, commanding the artillery crews, would later testify that his men had run that alarm sequence so many times that it had become, in his words, a reflex, not a decision. He meant it as a compliment to his unit's training. He did not yet know what kind of problem a reflex creates when the problem does not arrive from the expected direction. The doctrine had one more structural confidence built into it. German military engineers had studied assault climbing as a concept, and their conclusion was contained in a single line from the Festenspionierdienstmanual, Richtlinien für Dienstmanual Richtlinien für den Stellungsbau an der Küste, Guidelines for Coastal Position Construction, published in 1943. Vertical cliff faces of height exceeding 30 meters, under observed fire, are to be considered impassable to infantry without heavy engineer support and air superiority. The specification of 30 meters was not arbitrary. It was based on the maximum practical range of the Abschussvorrichtung für Wochenfuhr, the launching device for grappling hooks, which the German engineers had tested and found to be unreliable, dangerous, and slow to reload. They had concluded that if their own engineers struggled with grappling hooks in training, attacking infantry would find them impossible under fire. They were correct about everything except which army's grappling hooks they should have been studying. The German defensive system at Pointe du Hoc was a machine built on a premise. The premise was that gravity was the primary weapon. Everything else, the guns, the trenches, the concrete, was secondary to the simple, crushing certainty that 93 feet of vertical chalk would do most of the killing before a single MG-42 needed to fire. That premise was about to meet 225 men who had spent 11 months specifically designing their lives around defeating it. What the German system could not account for, it could not defend against. And what it could not account for had been invented in Scotland, tested in England, and loaded onto landing craft in the dark of June 5, 1944. Part 2. The Men Who Trained for the Impossible. Here is the core idea, and it is so simple that it took a specific kind of institutional stubbornness to believe in it. If the cliff is impassable, you do not find an alternative route. You train until the cliff is no longer impassable. You train until the act of climbing a 90-foot vertical face under fire is, if not routine, then at least practiced, and practiced repetitively enough that the body does it while the mind is occupied with being shot at. This was not American doctrine. The United States Army Field Manual FM 740, Infantry in Mountain Warfare, published in 1941, devoted 11 pages to cliff and mountain movement technique and concluded that assault climbing of defended vertical terrain requires combined arm support at a ratio not advisable for independent infantry units. The Rangers ignored it, not officially. They never repudiated the manual. They simply trained past it. The intellectual origin of the 2nd Ranger Battalion's cliff assault capability ran through the British Commandos, specifically No. 3 Commando and their collaboration with the Lochalot Special Training Centre in Verneshire, Scotland, where, beginning in 1940, British irregular warfare instructors had developed a systematic curriculum for what they called a posed vertical approach, a term precise enough to be bureaucratic and terrifying enough to be accurate. Major William Fairbairn, formerly of the Shanghai Municipal Police, and Captain Eric Sykes had designed the Lochalot curriculum around a single tactical philosophy: The defender's psychological certainty that a position is impassable is itself a defensive asset. Destroy that certainty through demonstrated capability, and you have already degraded the defense before a shot is fired. The 2nd Rangers arrived in Scotland in December 1943 and trained at Achnacarry Castle under Lieutenant Colonel Charles Vaughan's Commando Basic Training Centre. They climbed. Every day they climbed. Not on chalk cliffs, on Scottish granite, steeper in profile and less forgiving in texture. They climbed in full combat kit, M1 rifle, ammunition, entrenching tool, rations. They climbed in rain and in darkness. They climbed with simulated fire, real powder charges detonating at cliff base to create the pressure wave sensation of near misses. A training report from Achnacarry, dated February 1944, noted that the 2nd Rangers had achieved a vertical ascent time for a 60-foot training cliff of between 45 and 90 seconds per man, depending on rope saturation, meaning the congestion created by multiple men on the same rope line simultaneously. Rader pushed his officers to solve the saturation problem. The solution was simple: more ropes, more lines, wider frontage on the cliff face. That solution required hardware that did not yet exist in standard military inventory. The D7 grapnel, the standard U.S. Army grappling hook, weighed 6 pounds, required a running throw to achieve 30 feet of altitude, and had a failure rate under field conditions that a training memorandum from the Ranger Force described, with notable understatement, as not conducive to operational confidence. Rader's S4 logistics officer, Captain Harvey Cook, worked with British engineer teams at Weymouth in March 1944 to design a rocket-propelled grappling hook that could be fired from a 2-inch mortar tube mounted on a standard landing craft, throwing a toggle rope attached to a grapnel to a height of 120 feet with a success rate in final testing of 76% on the first attempt and 94% by the third. That number matters. 76% on the first attempt and 94% by the third. It means that at the moment of first contact with the cliff, nearly 1 in 4 ropes failed to seat properly. The Rangers had planned for this. Every section of 12 men carried 3 individual rocket launchers and 3 backup toggle rope lines for manual grappling. Failure was not a terminating event. It was an anticipated variable with a pre-planned contingency. 3 London Fire Brigade extension ladders, requisitioned in November 1943 by Ranger planning staff who had read a 1942 Royal Engineers study on vertical assault, were mounted on Duker W amphibious vehicles and brought into the assault flotilla. Each ladder could extend to a height of 100 feet when deployed from a stable platform. A 30 caliber machine gun was mounted to the top of each extended ladder, designed to provide suppressive fire directly onto the cliff top while the rope teams climbed. War correspondent Cornelius Ryan, who interviewed surviving Rangers for his 1959 book, The Longest Day, described the ladder due to UWs as one of the strangest pieces of equipment in the entire Allied inventory. A fire engine going to war. Ryan meant it as color. He did not fully appreciate that the absurdity was the point. The Germans had no category for a fire engine storming a beach. Pause on that detail. The Germans had catalogued every weapon system, every landing craft type, every known amphibious doctrine in Allied inventory. Their Coastal Defense Intelligence Summary, prepared by Kriegsmarine Abwehr Section 3 and distributed to Atlantic Wall Garrison commanders in April 1944, ran to 230 pages. It contained no reference to fire brigade extension ladders on amphibious vehicles. The system had no counter to a weapon it did not know existed. Here is the reframing sentence. The Germans were measuring success on one metric, rate of assault casualties per minute at cliff base. The Rangers were measuring success on a completely different metric, number of rope lines seated and climbable within 4 minutes of touch. Neither side could see the other's calculation. The Germans watched the approach and waited for the killing ground to fill. The Rangers were already 3 rungs up the rope before the killing ground reached its intended density. Part 3. The machine behind the ropes. The ropes and the rockets were visible. What was invisible? What the German garrison at Pointe du Hoc had no way of calculating was the institutional weight behind those ropes. The 2nd Ranger Battalion did not arrive on June 6th as an improvised response. They arrived as the output of a specific, deliberate American manufacturing process. A process that had been producing specialized soldiers since 1942 at a rate the Wehrmacht had no equivalent for. The Ranger program had been authorized by General George Marshall in June 1942 with a direct acknowledgement buried in the activation memorandum. The United States Army lacked a light infantry rating and assault force capable of the operations the British Special Service Brigade had demonstrated at Saint-Nazaire and Vauxhall. Marshall's solution was typically American in its logic. Build the capability fast, build it in volume, and build it with a training pipeline rigorous enough that washout rates became a quality control mechanism rather than an embarrassment. The 1st Ranger Battalion was activated in June 1942. By January 1944, 6 Ranger battalions were operational. The attrition during training, from injury, voluntary withdrawal, and failure to meet standards, ran to approximately 60% of each intake class. Rudder's 2nd Battalion had drawn its 500 men from an original candidate pool of roughly 1,200 volunteers. Pause on that number. Every man who loaded onto an assault craft on the morning of June 6th had already survived a selection process that eliminated 3 out of 5 volunteers. That is not an inspirational statistic. That is a description of the training pipeline's actual function. It did not produce Rangers. It identified the small percentage of men who were already, in some organic way, capable of becoming Rangers, and then it sharpened them. The equipment behind the assault was the product of a supply chain that stretched from Weymouth Harbor back to arsenals in Bridgeport, Connecticut, and Birmingham, England. The toggle ropes, braided manila climbing lines with wooden hand grips at 18-inch intervals, had been manufactured to a specification written by the Ranger planning staff in November 1943. The D-rings that attached grapples to rope ends were cold-forged from high-tensile steel at a Sheffield foundry. The 2-inch mortar tubes modified for Grapnel launch had been reworked at a Royal Ordnance Workshop in Portsmouth, their propellant charges adjusted by trial and error over 40 separate testing sessions to achieve the 120-foot trajectory reliably. Against this, the Wehrmacht's equivalent logistical reality at Pointe du Hoc was a garrison that had received its last major resupply of ammunition in late April 1944 that operated on a ration scale reduced by 15% following a Heeres Group B austerity order in March, and that, crucially, had relocated its 6 155mm howitzers 1,000 yards inland from the casements during the last week of May 1944, after Royal Air Force bombing had made the casemate positions untenable. The guns were now in an apple orchard near the village of Criquefort-en-Bessin, concealed under camouflage netting, pointed south toward inland targets. The casemates at Pointe du Hoc were empty. The German garrison knew this. The Ranger force did not. The individual human cost of that intelligence gap was carried by a 23-year-old Ranger private from Goldsboro, North Carolina, named Harry Roberts, who would later tell a Stars and Stripes correspondent that when his section reached the top of the cliff and fought their way to the first casemate, he looked inside and saw concrete floor and empty mounting hardware and thought, his exact words, recorded in the Stars and Stripes piece of September 1944, that somebody had very expensive mistakes, Miss September 1940, that somebody had made a fate. Roberts was right and wrong simultaneously. The mistake was real. The expense had already been paid, and the mission was not over. What Roberts and his comrades did not yet know, what they could not know in those first minutes of chaos on the cliff top, was that 2 Ranger patrols had already spotted the gun tracks leading inland, had followed them through an orchard hedgerow, and had found all 6 155mm howitzers sitting loaded, pointed south, with no crew present. Sergeant Leonard Lamel of D Company, 2nd Rangers, a 24-year-old from Toms River, New Jersey, took it upon himself to destroy all 6 guns with thermite grenades before returning to the perimeter. He did this with one other Ranger, Sergeant Jack Coon, operating approximately 1,200 yards from the nearest Ranger position, without orders, without radio contact with rudder, and with a bullet wound in his side that he had not yet reported. He destroyed the guns. Then he walked back. Every like on this video keeps the story of Lamel and Kuhn searchable for a few more people who have never heard their names. That matters. Part 4. The Realization. The men who began to understand what had happened to them at Pointe du Hoc were not junior officers reading reports. They were senior commanders whose professional identities were constructed around the premise that their positions were impregnable, and who spent the morning of June 6th watching that premise dissolve in real time. General Major Wilhelm Richter, commanding the 716th Infantry Division, received his first alarm signal from Pointe du Hoc at 7:15 hours 5 minutes after Rudder's first wave began climbing. His initial response, recorded in the 716th Division War Diary now held at the Bundesarchiv Militarchiv in Freiburg, was a request for clarification. Had the garrison's Küstenau been triggered by naval gunfire by parachutists, or by a ground assault? The question itself reveals the doctrinal limitation. Ritu's alarm categories included bombardment, airborne assault, and conventional beach landing. They did not include cliff assault. His staff spent 11 minutes, while Rangers climbed, attempting to classify the attack into an existing category before concluding it was a combined bombardment and small-scale infiltration, which triggered a response protocol designed for a raid rather than a seizure. Generalleutnant Dietrich Kreis, commanding the 350 Tongand Infantry Division, whose sector adjoined the 716th, had a clearer picture by 0800. His divisional intelligence officer, Hauptmann Bernard Maus, had received direct communication from a surviving observation post at Pointe du Hoc, confirming that American soldiers were on the clifftop and in the trench network. Kreis's response, documented in post-war interrogation records compiled by the U.S. Army Historical Division, was a counterattack order directed at the 914th Grenadier Regiment, retake the point with no less than 2 full companies, supported by the available heavy weapons. The counterattack was real, organized, and competently executed. By the evening of June 6, the Rangers, who had numbered 225 at the base of the cliff that morning, had been reduced to approximately 102 effective fighters. By the end of June 7, after 2 days of continuous combat, only 90 Rangers remained able to fight. Rudder himself had been wounded twice. He commanded from a forward position using a door salvaged from a bombed bunker as a desk. The 914th Grenadier Regiment's counterattack was not a rout. It was a grinding, professional assault by trained infantry against a thin defensive perimeter. For a Grenadier Battalion commander reading the tactical situation from the receiving end of Rudder's defenses, there was no obvious reason they should fail. The Rangers had no tanks. They had limited artillery support, a single naval fire support mission from the destroyer USS Satterlee, which had moved dangerously close to the rocky point to deliver direct fire on German counterattacking infantry. They were outnumbered. They were running low on ammunition by the morning of June 7th. The Germans did try to adapt. Kreis ordered a third assault option that had not appeared in his initial counterattack orders: infiltration through the hedgerow country north of the orchard, bypassing the Ranger perimeter and cutting off the point from relief. This was tactically sound. It nearly worked. A German platoon from the 914th succeeded in reaching the Grand Camp Road, the only viable route for Ranger relief, and held it for approximately 6 hours on June 7th, isolating Rudder's force completely. The relief force, elements of the 5th Ranger Battalion and the 29th Infantry Division, was blocked. Radio communication between Rudder and the command ship was intermittent. For 6 hours, Rudder's Rangers held Pointe du Hoc alone. What defeated the infiltration was not tactical genius. It was a naval fire mission, coordinates called by a Ranger forward observer named Lieutenant James Eichner, using a radio with a failing battery, that landed a pattern of destroyer fire across the hedgerow position with sufficient accuracy to force the German platoon to withdraw. The margin was measured in radio battery life. This is the nature of the thing. It does not resolve cleanly into doctrine versus doctrine. It resolves into men making specific decisions under specific pressure with specific equipment, and the equipment barely worked, and the decisions were barely right enough. For any German staff officer reviewing the Pointe du Hoc action in a post-war assessment, there was no comfortable tactical lesson to draw. The Rangers had been stopped several times. The point had nearly been retaken. The margin of failure was smaller than any triumphalist account acknowledges. What the German adaptation could not overcome was not the Ranger skill at climbing. That was survivable. What it could not overcome was the psychological fact already embedded in the German position by the moment the first rope was seated at cliff top. They were fighting men who had already done the thing that was supposed to be impossible. And men who have already done the impossible once have, in some irreversible way, recalibrated their understanding of what is possible next. Part 5. The Verdict. July 25, 1944. Cinqueux Sector, Normandy. Operation Cobra. The battle at Pointe du Hoc had ended 7 weeks earlier. The Rangers had been relieved on June 8th, reduced to 90 fighters from 225 who had begun the climb. The point itself, the headland, the shattered casemates, the cratered cliff top, remained in American hands. The 6 155mm American hands. The 6 155mm Hans Bills. They never fired over Beach 2 quit. They never fired a round at Utah Beach. The guns that were the entire strategic rationale for the assault, the guns for which 135 Rangers became casualties, were silenced by 2 men with thermite grenades in an apple orchard at 0830 hours. Here now is the forensic audit. The Germans were right about several things. They were right that the cliff was nearly impassable. The casualty rate during the ascent, men hit by small arms fire while on the ropes, men whose grapples slipped and fell back, ran to approximately 25% before the cliff top was reached. They were right that the assault force was inadequate to hold the point against determined counterattack. Rudder's 90 remaining effective fighters on June 8th were a single German battalion from destroying the position. They were right, most strangely, that the guns were not in the casemates. Their relocation of the howitzers was a sensible response to Allied air pressure. The metric the German system was using was causal lethality per unit of terrain. How many attackers can this position kill per minute of approach? The answer, at Pointe du Hoc, was approximately 2.5 casualties per minute during the initial assault phase. By that metric, the position was performing as designed. It was killing Rangers at a rate that, if sustained, would exhaust the assault force before it could become dangerous. The actual metric the Ranger force was using was time to effect on the primary objective. How long does it take to neutralize 6 155mm howitzers from the moment of first rope contact with the cliff? The answer was 80 minutes. The guns were destroyed at 0830. The first ropes left the cliff base at a 7 Ken. Every Ranger casualty, every failed grapnel, every German counterattack was irrelevant to that specific calculation. The guns were silenced. The beaches were protected. The invasion continued. The philosophical core lies in the distance between those two metrics. The German system was optimized to destroy the force. The Ranger force was optimized to destroy the objective. Those are not the same mission, and a defensive system designed to stop one cannot automatically stop the other. An army that measures success by terrain held and enemies killed will always underestimate an army that measures success by objectives seized and timeframes met. This is not a lesson from 1944 alone. It is a permanent structural truth about how doctrine shapes the questions an institution allows itself to ask, and therefore shapes the answers it is capable of seeing. It compounded in the form of the 135 Rangers who became casualties between 0710 0800 on June 6, climbing ropes up a cliff toward guns that had been moved. It compounded in the form of Sergeant Lomel walking into an orchard alone with a bullet in his side and destroying 6 artillery pieces that could have ended the invasion. It compounded in the form of Rudder commanding from a bombed door for 48 hours, wounded twice, refusing evacuation, because the alternative was giving the point back to people who had already proved they could defend it. It compounded in the form of the German 914th Grenadier Regiment's counterattack failing, not because the Rangers defeated it, but because a destroyer pushed dangerously close to a rocky point and a forward observer's radio battery held long enough to call the coordinates. It compounded in the form of every subsequent amphibious assault in American doctrine, from Incheon in 1950 to the planning assumptions behind every Marine Expeditionary Unit today that inherited the operational logic Rudder's men demonstrated that a defended vertical approach is not impossible if the force training, equipment, and command philosophy are purpose-built for the specific act of making it possible. The doctrine that scaled Pointe du Hoc on June 6, 1944, did not remain confined to the Normandy headland. It traveled into the Cold War as the foundation of American Ranger and Special Forces vertical assault doctrine. In October 1983, at Grenada, U.S. Army Rangers parachuted onto Point Salines airfield and conducted helicopter assault operations against defended terrain using command philosophies, decentralized execution, pre-planned contingencies for equipment failure, time on objective as the governing metric that traced a direct doctrinal line to Rudder's planning documents from March 1944. In 2001, the same principles reached the mountains of Afghanistan. Whether they remain adequate to the next form of defended terrain, one that may not be chalk and rope but data and spectrum, is a different story. But it starts here. One sentence for the men who made it possible. James Rudder led his Rangers up a cliff toward empty gun emplacements and did not stop fighting for 2 days, and the invasion succeeded, and he never once described it as anything other than what it was, a thing that had to be done by the people who were there. Here is the verdict. The Germans built an impregnable fortress around a weapon they had already moved. The Rangers destroyed it anyway. The fortress was never the point. The guns were the point. And the men who knew the difference, who could distinguish between the object of the defense and the object of the mission, those men changed the outcome of the largest amphibious invasion in human history in 80 minutes, on ropes, in the dark, from the sea. That is what doctrine that has forgotten its own purpose loses to doctrine that never forgets its objective.